Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Driving Demand, What the Clean Fuel Regulations Mean for Canadian Canola Farmers. Thank you for joining us today. I'm your moderator, Chris Vervaet, Executive Director of the Canadian Oilseed Processors Association, or COPA. The Canadian canola industry has a big opportunity to meet the growing demand for canola-based biofuels as we look to implement the Clean Fuel Regulations, or CFR, as it's commonly known. Today, we're joined by industry experts who will present details around the CFR, shed light on what this legislation means for your farm, and the opportunities it presents. It's important to note that the information provided during the webinar does not represent an official or legal interpretation of the Clean Fuel Regulation. We trust that you'll find value in today's discussion. We have three great speakers with us today. Kicking things off is Michelle Belisle, Regulatory Affairs and Planning Advisor with Imperial Oil, who will provide you with an overview of the CFR from the fuel producer's perspective. Secondly, we have Brian Kahn, President of Canadian Oilseeds with Louis Dreyfus Company and Vice Chair of the Canadian Oilseed Processors Association. He'll discuss value-added processing and explain CFR participation. Last but not least, we have Dean Roberts, a farmer from Colville, Saskatchewan, a Canola Council Farmer Director, and Vice Chair of SaskCanola. Dean will cover the opportunities at the farm gate that the CFR presents. To kick things off, I'll pass it over to Michelle.
Thanks, Chris. As Chris said, I'm Michelle Belisle. I'm a Regulatory Affairs Advisor with Imperial Oil, and here to share the renewable fuel industry's perspective and the fuel industry's perspective on the CFR and the opportunities that the CFR presents. So the Canadian fuel industry shares the country's bold greenhouse gas emission reduction aspirations and is committed to continuing to provide the fuel Canadians have come to rely on. We recognize that a diverse range of fuels will be required to meet the needs of the various vehicle types, geographies, and climates of the Canadian customers and businesses we serve, all while reducing emissions in the transportation sector. At Imperial, we recognize the important role we can play by advancing climate solutions within our operations and by providing lower life cycle emission fuel products to our customers. The Clean Fuel Regulations, or CFR, is one of the policies that will help Canadian fuel sector reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the fuels we produce and use in Canada. As you can see on the chart on the left, the objective of the CFR is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation fuels in Canada by mandating lower carbon content or a lower carbon intensity of these fuels, reducing over time. Canadian Fuels Association members, including Imperial, support the Clean Fuel Regulations and its full life cycle approach, which means it accounts for the emissions associated with all of the stages of fuel production and use. These regulations are a market-based policy that are technology neutral, meaning all technologies are accepted and valued based on their contributions to greenhouse gas emission reductions. This kind of policy creates a cost-effective mechanism, allowing the industry to drive innovation and deliver emission reductions in the transportation sector. Some of the technologies supported under the CFR include low carbon hydrogen, electrification in transportation, and actions like carbon capture and storage in fuel production, and importantly, and the focus of this discussion, the use of biofuels in Canadian fuels. Biofuels with a carbon intensity below the annual mandate, which is shown for diesel and gasoline on the chart on the left-hand side, will earn a credit. And the lower biofuels carbon intensity, the more credits it can earn. We can see on the chart on the right, the 2021 ExxonMobil Energy Outlook, that we're predicting rapid growth in the Canadian biofuel demand to support lower emission transportations in all sectors, in addition to meet the obligations incurred under the Clean Fuel Regulation. So now we can go to the next slide, please. The CFR is a really strong policy signal that acts as a catalyst for private sector investment in lower carbon fuel production, with more than $8 billion in capital projects announced or under construction. You can see from the map that the investments are being made by the fuels industry across the country from coast to coast to deliver a system-wide solution supporting Canada's climate goals and our transportation requirements. These investments are being made across all technologies, including biofuels, hydrogen, and electricity for transportation. With the extensive infrastructure, our industry's expertise in refining and logistics operations, and the natural resources available in Canada, the increased demand for lower carbon transportation fuels provides our country with a unique opportunity to become a leader in lower carbon fuels. Biofuels derived from lower carbon feedstocks like canola are amongst the largest areas of investment, particularly in the renewable diesel production area. And Winnie, we can go to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the renewable fuels that can be potentially from canola-based feedstocks. So they're mainly going to be in the distillate range or a replacement for conventional fossil diesel fuels, including jet fuel. So in the center of this diagram, we have biodiesel, and this has been used for many years to incorporate renewable fuels into diesel products. It's compatible with engine technologies when blended with diesel fuel, and depending on the climate conditions and end uses, can be used for up to 20% of the fuel's volume. Beyond this quantity, we run into what we call blend wall limits, where the blended fuel qualities aren't consistent with the conventional diesel fuel or necessarily with the engine technology. So while a great source of renewable fuel and greenhouse gas reductions in diesel, biodiesel has some limitations. Renewable diesel, which is shown in green on the left-hand side of this diagram, is what we call a drop-in fuel, meaning that it's nearly identical with conventional diesel and can be used interchangeably with diesel fuels. This can remove the blending limitations that we see with biodiesel and increase up to 100% the use of renewable diesel in engine technology. When we look at a typical tractor that might be used by a canola farmer, this tractor could potentially run on 100% renewable diesel produced from the canola grown on their farm, truly representing a circular economy. On the right-hand side, we've got sustainable aviation fuel, and this really refers to any non-fossil jet fuel, including biofuels. This fuel is seen as the primary pathway to reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the aviation sector and is approved for use when blended up to 50% with conventional jet fuel, although there have been some successful test flights on 100% sustainable aviation fuel. So with no blend wall limitations for renewable diesel, and the expected growth in the use of sustainable aviation fuel, we predict that demand for these fuels to continue to grow, and with it, the demand for feedstocks like canola. Whitney, if we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So to meet the growing biofuel demand, the fuels industry is growing production. Imperial is progressing construction on a world-scale renewable diesel complex at our Strathcona refinery in Edmonton, Alberta. Our renewable diesel will represent a premium, lower carbon, drop-in fuel, enabling our customers to reduce their carbon emissions while meeting the challenges of Canada's climate. The facility is expected to produce about 20,000 barrels or 3 million liters of renewable diesel a day, which will be used to fuel harder to decarbonize sectors such as road transportation, industry, and Canada's rail network. We're excited to leverage low carbon intensity hydrogen produced with carbon capture and storage technology to further lower the carbon intensity of our renewable diesel. The 1 billion liters of renewable diesel produced at this facility per year is estimated to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by about 3 million tons compared to conventional fuels. And our facility will utilize locally sourced renewable feedstocks like canola oil to produce the renewable diesel fuel that helps our customers lower their carbon emissions. But the benefit of a world-scale facility isn't limited to the renewable fuel it produces or the emission reductions, but we felt throughout the entire low-value carbon chain. Imperial's renewable diesel facility will require approximately 20,000 barrels of locally sourced renewable feedstocks, like locally grown and crushed canola oil every day. Over a year, that's roughly 1 million metric tons of canola oil, representing the capacity of 2 to 3 new crush plants. And to supply those crush plants, approximately 2.5 million metric tons of canola seed will be required. This can represent a significant new and diversified demand for the Canadian canola oil and a stable domestic demand for multiple decades to come. Fuel facilities are typically built for multiple decades, if not a century. Our Sarnia refinery has been producing fuel for over 125 years, and we're excited for our renewable diesel facility to do the same. The Imperial facility is just one of the Canadian biofuel projects either under construction or evaluation. Renewable diesel production capacity in Canada could exceed 4 billion liters by the end of this decade, increasing the opportunities and demand for canola oil. In addition to Imperial's renewable diesel facility, from 2021 through 2023, we piloted co-processing trials in our refinery in Nanticoke, Sarnia, and Strathcona, where bio-based feedstocks were processed along with conventional fossil feedstocks to successfully produce fuels with renewable content and reduce carbon intensity. Yet another potential demand source for canola oil in Canada. We're also exploring producing sustainable aviation fuels using renewable feedstocks. The clean fuel regulations are central to the long-term outlook of the Canadian fuels industry and will benefit all aspects of the renewable fuel supply chain, including our essential upstream partners in the agriculture industry. But to capture the full benefit under the clean fuel regulations, the biofuels must be produced using eligible feedstocks. And that's where I'll turn to our partners in the grain industry to continue.
Great, thanks very much, Michelle, appreciate that. The CFR and other programs that incentivize biofuels have spurred a once-in-a-generation boom in new crush capacity. We've already seen exciting developments in crush capacity over the last number of years. Crush has grown from 7 million tons in 2013-14 to just over 11 million tons this year in 23-24, supporting growth in food, feed, and fuel demand, an increase of over 50%. In lockstep with recent investments in biofuel production, such as renewable diesel, 5 new canola processing investments have been announced since 2021, adding an additional 7 million tons of canola processing capacity, which will take us to over 18 million tons, an increase of an additional 60%. Combined, these investments exceed over $2.5 billion, adding 400 new direct jobs and thousands of indirect and induced jobs, supporting not only the facilities, but local communities as well. 3 of the 5 investments are already under construction, with additional capacity expected to come online starting in 2024 and again in 2025. Increasing canola crush capacity to supply a growing domestic biofuel market underscores a significant market diversification opportunity biofuels and programs like the CFR are for everyone in the value chain. A larger market in our backyard not only reduces exposure to often unpredictable and inconsistent international markets, but also supports value creation closer to home here in Canada. As we embark on supplying growing biofuel demand and contribute to lowering GHG emissions from transportation fuels, it's important to remember that the canola industry will continue to service and grow with the long-standing needs of our existing and new food and feed customers. Demand from biofuels is additive in nature, and there are no trade-offs supplying oil and meal for food, feed, or our fuel customers. Next slide, please. As the crush and broader grain industry gear up to take advantage of growing opportunities in the CFR market, the rules of engagement are important to understand. Fundamental to many new renewable fuel markets is the need to demonstrate compliance with sustainability requirements related to land use, change, and biodiversity, or LUB. The CFR contains 4 LUB criteria that must be met in order to participate in the market, which can be seen on this slide. These criteria include wildlife habitat, damaging agents, indirect land use, and excluded land. Canadian and US feedstock comply with these criteria through specific exemptions and provisions in the regulation, which will help streamline compliance for farmers and others in the supply chain. To confirm the eligibility of crops used in the CFR, it must be traced through the supply chain. Traceability is not new to the grain supply chain, and in fact, is a growing requirement to meet customer demands and access markets around the world. The CFR uses attestations to track and trace the feedstock, and the requirements are streamlined to better align with the realities of Canada's grain supply chain. Next slide, please. Most notably, crops grown in Canada already meet the LUB criteria requirements through exemptions and provisions in the CFR. No additional certification needs to be provided, only a statement confirming that the crop was grown in Canada and therefore eligible for the regulatory exemptions and provisions is required. Next, only a single set of GPS coordinates will need to be provided. These coordinates need to be representative of the harvested area. Examples would include the farmyard or where the bins are located. Attestations will be required one time per year to cover the crop production for that year. Next slide, please. The industry is working with the grain value chain, including farm organizations, to develop guidance on attestation language that is simple and consistent for everyone to use. Once the guidance has been completed, the language can be incorporated into standard contracts, added to the existing grain producer attestation, or serve as a standalone contract, or standalone document, pardon me. We are optimistic about the opportunities the CFR has initiated for our industry, and we look forward to working with our fuel and our farm customers to maximize participation in this very exciting new area. Now I'd like to turn it over to Dean to discuss the grower perspective.
Thank you, Brian. So I, like many growers, have had a lot of questions about the CFR and what it will look like on our farms. Through my involvement with the CCGA, I maybe get Canadian Canola Growers Association, I maybe get a little bit more knowledge of the CFR than my fellow farmers, but I still found I had a lot of questions. One of the questions I don't have is the benefit of the CFR in market diversification, increasing demand for canola, and increasing crushing capacity, adding value to our crop. As a farmer, I think about market demand in two different ways in two different markets. I have my local direct market, the elevators and the crushers, which I deliver my grain directly to, and then the larger indirect global market that my grain eventually ends up in. So this slide kind of speaks to increased demand in both markets and how changing demand might look at the farm gate. So the first point, more competition for canola seed, raising the overall value of canola. I witnessed that on my farm this year. Early on after harvest, strong crush margins led to strong demand from crushers. That pulled a lot of my crop directly into the crush market and not much into the export market. Over the year, as the crush plants filled and demand softened globally overall, the price followed, landing closer to what export markets would be. The thing that I took from that was that the competition for the crop increased the overall value that I was receiving for it at the farm gate. The next point around crush expansion is increased delivery options, and this speaks more to the direct market demand and competition. The CFR encourages crush plant expansion in Canada, as Brian just mentioned, and that expansion obviously benefits farmers. Crush plants buy canola differently than export companies. It's a different use, a different market. I'm fortunate our farm is on the edge of a crush plant draw area. That has afforded us better flexibility for off-grade and off-spec canola. The crushers just have a little more flexibility to deal with some of those grains than the exporters do. But having access to both a domestic buyer and an export buyer provides me more options to market my crop and participate in whichever market was strongest at that time. Then the third point I'll bring up, and you've heard it once or twice already, and I'm going to repeat it a couple of times because it is important, is the market diversification, including value-added marketing opportunities for oil and meal. Global markets are critical for canola, but they can be unpredictable, sometimes subject to bans or other restrictions that may be based on geopolitics and not science. The CFR helps create a domestic market that reduces our dependency on those exports. Currently, 90% of our seed is exported to only 5 markets, and 75% of those exports are destined for only 2 markets. While these export markets are important and valued, farmers are vulnerable should conditions suddenly change. So echoing what Brian said before, supporting value-add jobs in Canada, local economic impact, good paying jobs in our communities closer to home, capturing more of the value of our crop and exporting less of it. I think that's beneficial for everyone and fairly self-evident. The last 2 points are around encouraging investment in the canola sector and biofuels more broadly. Canola has a strong history of innovation. Canola was originally developed to produce cooking oil for our domestic market. We actually had to import cooking oil into Canada, but through research and innovation, we have got really good at growing canola and now export it worldwide. Canola oil goes to over 50 markets globally. But you're never really done investing in research. There's always more that can be looked at, more that can be done. But what does that mean in the context of the CFR? For me, that means keeping canola part of the discussion. We've been told today that canola is one of the preferred low-carbon feedstocks, and that fact helps keep canola as an attractive option for investment. And Kind of along those lines, but different, both the CCGA and Canola Council have worked with the federal government to try and ensure the implementation of the CFR would allow farmers to meet the increased demand for canola without having undue burden on Canadian farmers and the supply chain more broadly. And I think Brian did a good job of showing us some of what that LUB criteria looks like in its current form. Can I get the next slide, please, Whitney? So I just want to take a little bit of a moment here to take a deeper dive into the global market concentration of canola. As farmers, we all know our local direct market quite well, the elevators and the agents, who you want to deal with, who you don't want to. What some of us maybe aren't aware of is just how concentrated our larger indirect market is. And I talked about it in the previous slide. Canola relies heavily on 4 to 5 global markets. Here is how they stack up. And 75% of our exports go to only 2 of those on the left. We are very concentrated. But I will draw your attention to the Japanese market, which has historically been around 2.5 million metric tons. That 1 billion liter plant Michelle talked about earlier is also 2.5 million metric tons of seed. So that is roughly equivalent to the Japanese market, and would fit in right next to Japan there for a destination for our crop potentially. So I'm nearing the end of what I wanted to share with you today. If you take nothing else away from this, market diversification is important to a crop that is vulnerable to market disruption. Increasing demand should hopefully translate into increased value and predictability for farmers. Thank you, and I will now pass the mic back to Chris.
Okay, thanks very much, Dean. And thank you to all the panelists. Some great perspective provided by all of you. It's now time for our Q&A period. So please continue to add questions to the Q&A tab. We see plenty flowing in already. If we don't have time to answer them all live, we'll follow up with you by email after the webinar. And you can always reach out to Whitney with some additional questions as well. Okay, so let's tuck into the questions. The first question is, does the demand for renewables align with the supply of canola oil available in the next 5 to 10 years? Great question. And I thought I would start with Brian maybe to answer this question and then allow the other panelists to chime in if they wish. Brian?
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Chris. Now, I think what you're seeing from the crush industry is a very good signal in terms of the growth in crush capacity that you've seen from recent announcements in the last few years. Certainly, I think a lot of those have been directed because of the biofuels announcements, specifically the CFR. And I think it's an attempt by the industry to grow in concert with, as we see both renewable diesel and co-processing capacity grow. We're looking to see canola grow as its share as part of as that capacity continues to grow. So I think that we're seeing good growth on both sides of the ledger, both in terms of crush and in terms of the renewable fuels capacity that we're seeing from participants like Imperial.
Something I might add along those lines, Chris, too. We've had a couple of challenging years of production. We've had the 21 drought. We've had some heat blasts. We've had a number of challenging issues with our growing season. But we still have a fairly large carryout coming this year at 2 million metric tons. If we'd have had closer to an average crop, that number might have been larger. So I'm a farmer. I'm always optimistic that it's going to be wet this summer and we're going to have a bigger crop. So I think an extra market won't hurt.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Dean. Here's another question that has come in. Will there be a federal credit program, and what kind of transparency will be offered to credit prices? So this is all about implementation of the regulation. It is live today, of course, and it is continuing to roll out, but this is a really good question about the finer points of the regulation related to transparency on credits. And maybe I can call on you, Michelle, to take a stab at answering this question.
Great. Thanks, Chris. So as you said, under the CFR, we are live and credits have been beginning to be created as of mid-2022. Under this program, credits are created under any of the enabled pathways, so including biofuel production or importation into Canada. We're expecting the CFR program will have a number of metrics reported out by Environment and Climate Change Canada, including the number of credits created under each of the different pathways, details on the credits being transacted, including credit pricing. But as you said, we are live, and we're very kind of briefly into the onset of the CFR, with our first compliance period just ending as of the end of 2023, and reporting on credit creation and compliance reporting still continuing over the next few months. So Environment and Climate Change Canada is still developing exactly what metrics they'll be providing and what those will look like. We fully expect there will be some kind of transparency on credit pricing and credit transaction, but we'll need to see this program mature a little bit before we can get more details on exactly what will be reported.
Great. And maybe a build on this question, Michelle. Is it common for low carbon fuel programs like the CFR to have this type of transparency? And why is it important in terms of having that transparency?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if we look at more mature programs, so British Columbia has had a very similar low carbon fuel standard in place for effectively a decade now. And with that maturity comes a lot of maturity in that credit pricing and just information, I'll call it metrics in general from the program. California has a similar program, and again, a lot of transparency on credit pricing. And the importance of the credit pricing is really to guide the industry to understand what the valuation of these credits are, so that we can determine what steps to take to generate these credits, how much is a credit worth, and what we should be doing to create those credits.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. Here's a $1 million question that I get regularly as I speak to the growth of crush expansion in Canada and the United States as well. And the question is, what are the opportunities for all the meal that will be produced from all this expanded crush? So, Brian, I think you're best placed to kick us off with responding to this question.
Sure. I think the industry has done a tremendous job in terms of placing canola meal in high-value markets in North America, in the US and Canada. And I dare say I think the coverage is very good. But certainly with the growth that we've seen, that we expect to see in crush capacity, we're going to be looking for new markets for our meal. And we believe that when we look to China and Southeast Asia, we see a lot of good potential in both those markets and areas where canola meal can price itself competitively versus other protein sources. And then we also have good access into those markets as well. And they have markets that are also growing as well. And indeed, we're starting to see some of those flows take place already. So I'm quite optimistic we're going to be able to find homes for the meal in offshore destinations, but continue to supply our domestic market quite fully as well.
So like I said, I often get this question when I'm speaking to the subject of expanded crush. A related question to this is the markets, of course, but is the infrastructure there? Do we have the supply chain and the infrastructure ready to move more of this meal to some of those offshore markets you just mentioned?
I believe we do. I think we have very good handlers and originators, not just in the country, but also on the West Coast in Vancouver and Prince Rupert. And we have very efficient capacity there. So I think the ability to include canola meal in addition to the regular grains and oilseeds that are handled, I think is going to be quite strong. And I don't see that as a bottleneck over time to be able to access those overseas markets.
So we're ready to do it.
Absolutely.
Here's another question that has just come in. This is a great question as it builds on the common theme that all of you touched upon, which is market diversification and the importance of it. So the question is, how does a sudden market closure or interruption impact a farmer's bottom line? I can't think of anybody better to respond to this question than you, Dean.
Well, I think it's no secret we had a significant market access issue with China a few years back. When that market closed, our export price fell out from underneath of us. I believe half of our crop was going to China at that time. One of the things that softened that blow was selling into the European biofuel market. Europe was dealing with a drought and was looking for feedstock. So I think that there is a precedent out there for market disruption to happen. I think that the environment we operate in now is more unpredictable than ever. I don't know what news headline would be shocking anymore. And I think that the precedent for biofuel demand supporting prices is also out there and ultimately softening that blow to farmers in the event we have a trade disruption of some kind.
Thanks very much, Dean. They're coming in fast and furious, folks. Doing my best here to try to collate these all in my head as the questions come in. Here's a good one. Brian, you did a great job in terms of unpacking what we think will be required in terms of the rules of engagement as we described it. Could you speak a little bit to what changes farmers might have to make to implement the CFR? Maybe just to unpack some of those slides that you walked us through earlier.
Sure, no problem. I think it's important to reiterate that a lot of the exemptions and provisions that the CFR provides takes away a lot of the other documentation that would otherwise be required in order for canola feedstock to be considered CFR compliant. And since those exemptions and provisions have been baked into the regulation, it really makes the whole documentation process a lot simpler. We talked a little bit about the LUB criteria in terms of wildlife habitat, damaging agents, indirect land use, and excluded land. And the fact that an attestation that's required that the crop is grown in Canada with the GPS coordinates, I think really helps to try and streamline a lot of the documentation that's required. So I think a lot of good work's been done by the industry and the grower associations to try and make it as streamlined as possible. And I think that documentation, once it gets rolled out here this year, I think we'll see the results of that.
Great. Thank you. Here's a common question. And maybe, Michelle, you're best placed to respond to this one. When does the renewable diesel demand start to kick in for canola? And maybe more specifically, if you can respond to this one, what is the timing for Imperial's facility specifically?
Thanks, Chris. So I would say to start off, I would say the demand is already here. Imperial's facility is expected to start up in 2025. It's currently under construction. And so we're really excited to start being a domestic producer of renewable diesel, beginning in 2025. In terms of demand, British Columbia, like I said, has had a low carbon fuel standard in place for a decade. And renewable diesel is a key credit creation mechanism in that standard, as it will be, we expect, under the CFR. So with the CFR creating credits beginning in the middle of 2022 and an obligation to fuel suppliers such as ourselves starting in the middle of 2023, renewable diesel is needed, back a year and a half ago and continuing into the future. This year in 2024 will be our first full year of obligation as fuel producers. And so we're going to require even more product and more credits to meet our obligations for this year. If we think back to that first slide with that reducing carbon intensity mandate that the CFR requires year over year, fuel suppliers are going to need to put increasing biofuel or have an increasing number of credits each year to be compliant under the CFR. And so when we look at, all the knobs and levers that are available, because of the absence of blend wall restrictions that exist in biodiesel or ethanol, for example, renewable diesel really is the flywheel that we can use as producers to maintain our compliance here. So demand has started, and it's only going to ramp up from here through at least the end of the decade.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. A related question to this all came as one question, and maybe this is more back to you, Brian. Is the crush capacity aligning with this kickstart of demand? Is the progression of new capacity meeting, or is it synced with the new capacity that's coming online for renewable diesel?
I would say in general, yes. Certainly there's always fits and starts to increases in crush capacity and then increases in biofuels capacity. So it's difficult to nail it exactly, but I'd say in general, when you see the timing of the announcements, what's currently under construction on both sides of the ledger between the crush and call it renewable diesel and co-processing facilities, I think there is general paths forward for both of them that are moving in relative lockstep. There might be some dislocations, over the next year or so as each capacity builds out. But I think when you look at the next kind of 2 to 5 year window, I see good growth in both of those, both sides of the ledger to get us where we want to be.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Brian. Here's another common question that I've seen in the Q&A. And again, from my speaking engagements, I get this a lot. Does this initiative raise a competition, the initiative being the clean fuel regulation or biofuels generally, does it raise competition on fuel versus food as canola's end use? So Brian, maybe I can ask you to kick this question off or the response off, but I think this is maybe germane to everyone on the panel to maybe provide some perspective on this question, because again, it's one that is common and that we get often.
Well, I think the great part of our canola industry is that it's additive and can grow with what developing needs and markets are. Today, we do, as an industry, a very good job of supplying our food and feed customers in North America and worldwide. And I see this growth that we have in crush capacity really trying to envelop or encompass the growing fuel demand that we're seeing as well. So we don't see this as a robbing Peter to pay Paul exercise. We see plenty of growth in terms of capacity to grow with our food and feed customers today, and in addition, grow capacity to service the growing fuel demand that we have as well. So we do not see trade-offs in terms of customers. We see the ability to grow to be able to service all customers.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, food versus fuel is a bit of a misnomer. I think what we're really saying, and what I've heard from you, Brian, is that it's really about food and fuel. Michelle, Dean, did you want to add any context to this particular question on food and fuel?
Yeah, Chris, maybe I'll jump in and just say that we think, canola oil will be a major source, especially in the Canadian prairies, as a coveted feedstock. But the industry is also working on a number of other feedstocks, including waste oil, right? So even, it could be a fuel after food potentially for used cooking oil is one of the major sources of, feedstocks that we're looking at from a carbon intensity perspective as well. Using a waste product lowers the carbon intensity on a life cycle basis of a final fuel produced. So in addition to the food and fuel, it's an all of above solution. We need to be using feedstocks, we need to be using waste feedstocks, and then innovation, and this is really for the liquid fuels that we be producing as well. We start looking at medium duty, heavy duty transportation. Hydrogen comes into the play, so it's really an everything and the kitchen sink solution to respond to the climate initiatives that Canada has and the greenhouse gas emission reductions that we all have.
I like what you said there on innovation, and maybe that's a great place for you to pick up, Dean, on some innovation that happens at the farm level to continue to produce more on the same amount of land. So maybe if you could add some additional context, Dean, that would be great.
Well, absolutely, Chris. As a board member for one of the prairie grower commissions, we invest heavily in research every year to keep driving innovation forward, keep finding yield and improvements, agronomic practice improvements, so that we can keep growing more crop and get better at growing the crop we're currently growing. So I still feel we have room to get better and continue to get more innovative, higher yield, and supply both markets. The biofuel right now, and I think farmers are hearing that and going to look at ways to improve.
Great. An important issue that I thought all of you did a terrific job answering the question. Going through some more questions here. Again, thank you everybody for providing so many questions, all of them terrific. Again, I'm trying to pick out the common questions here. Here's another common one. I presume cost of renewable diesel production with canola is higher than petroleum-based diesel production. How is that addressed? And might it slow industry's growth? So Michelle, perhaps I can direct that question to you. And certainly if other panelists want to chime in, please do.
Sure. So I would say first that the cost of any commodity product is really based on the open market. So whether it's conventional diesel, whether it's crude as a feedstock or renewable diesel, it's really a commodity product, and you'd be partially based on the demand. When we look at renewable diesel versus conventional diesel, we really start with those feedstocks, and so that's where that kind of the production price is going to start. Canola typically is higher than crude, although we've seen these markets turn on their heads very quickly. But I don't think that's a risk for production or for this industry to step up. Producing a highly sought after product and a highly valuable product, conversely, should probably be driving the industry to moving more towards that production. And I think that is what we're talking about kind of in an open market. But then we start layering on regulations like the CFR, which are going to require fuel producers to incorporate a certain amount of renewable content or credits to offset an obligation created under the regulation. And again, renewable diesel is really going to be that flywheel, especially in Canada in winter months, for blending into the diesel pool to create those credits. So I think there's a strong drive for the industry to really pick up on renewable diesel and biofuels in general, to not only meet, greenhouse gas reduction targets, but also regulatory requirements.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. Going through here, just pause for a second. Let our panelists maybe get a sip of water if they need it. Okay, here's one for you, Brian. I think you're best suited for it. How much will exports shrink by the end of the decade? And what are those dynamics between crush and seed that has typically been exported offshore?
Well, I think if you look at the evolution in the last number of years, as we mentioned before, we've seen crush capacity grow from back in 2013-14 was 7 million tons. And if you go back to 2006-2007 was around 4 million tons. So you've seen quite good and steady growth within that crush space over the last number of years. Up 3 years ago, prior to the drought year, we were crushing about 10 million tons and exporting about 10 million tons. And certainly we think with additional crush capacity, we're going to have the ledger tilted a little more in favor of domestic crush versus exports. We certainly see growth in productivity over time, as Dean was alluding to, in a lot of the technological advancements that are made with the crop. So we certainly do expect to see the crop continue to grow over time. But we do think that there'll be more of a slant towards domestic processing for all the reasons and rationales that we've been talking about. There will certainly be an export market, but I think what we've seen in the last couple of years is a lot of volatility, as we've mentioned, in terms of that export demand. And one of the things about having domestic crush demand servicing the domestic market in Canada and the US is that it's more consistent, is that it's not subject to some of the vagaries that we've seen for exports in the past. So I think while the exports may decline a little bit over time compared to where they've been, the fact that you have assured demand locally, I think, is going to be quite an important aspect for the demand for the overall industry.
That's great, Brian. And one thing I often hear when that question is asked, or what is sometimes lost, is that folks then assume markets are static, right? That the market doesn't respond and that we don't see a supply response as well as it relates to more canola being produced. And I think Dean covered that off nicely in terms of some of the innovations that are happening on the farm to produce more canola on the same amount of land. That's been the track record for canola over the decades. And I think there's every reason to be optimistic that that trend will continue.
I think that's exactly right. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Nope, go ahead, Brian.
I was just going to add, and also the only constant is change, not just here, but also in other markets worldwide as well. Certainly, we're seeing big growth in Australia in terms of its crop production, and another one of the reasons why exports have declined in the last couple of years out of Canada here as well. So, we'd like to think that some things can stay the same, but certainly there's a lot of different pieces in the world that are changing quite a bit, and we're certainly seeing that here in Canada as well. But I think those are factors to consider as well.
Definitely. Yeah, we don't operate in a vacuum. We are part of the global community. And maybe that's a great segue into this next question. The question is related to the Inflation Reduction Act. I expect several of the folks who have dialed into this webinar will have heard of that particular legislation in the United States that provides quite a handsome amount of subsidies for different low carbon initiatives, including tax credits for biofuel production. So here is the question, and I think, Michelle, you're going to be the person best to address this one. But again, welcome anyone else from the panel to chime in. With the U.S. blenders credit turning into a production credit at the end of this year, how do you see Canadian biofuel producers competing with subsidized U.S. production?
Thanks, Chris. I think, there's no question that the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act and the producers tax credit under the IRA are putting Canadian producers at a disadvantage. So we, as an industry, have been working with government to help them understand what that disadvantage is to the Canadian producer, and requesting incentive support to continue a Canadian biofuel production environment in Canada. This is a really unique opportunity for Canada to decide if we want to put that value add on Canadian soil, all the way from the farm gate, right? So from Dean's kind of perspective, growing and harvesting canola, to Brian in terms of crushing and moving it to a fuel producer, to domestically support Canada's, transportation sector, the renewable fuel that we want to be incorporating into Canada's transportation fuels, provide energy security, and the products that Canadians need. So not to get into too many technical details, but fuel in Canada looks different than fuel in the US. The diesel and the cloud point, or the point at which diesel can gel under very cold conditions, is different in Canada than it is in the US Gulf Coast. And so we not only want, but need production in Canada that can meet those fuel quality specifications. And as what could be seen as a niche market to the US, we're not expecting that, US Gulf Coast is going to be producing cloud specs that meet Canadian winter standards. So we really hope that the government starts looking at biofuel as an industry in Canada. The Inflation Reduction Act is not is exactly what it is described as. It's an industrial policy, right? It's not just a green plan, it's an industrial policy for the future. And really hope the Canadian government starts looking at developing this in Canada as well to support Canadian producers.
Great answer. Again, we don't operate in a vacuum, right? We do compete with other jurisdictions. We cooperate with other jurisdictions as well, but we need to have a level playing field. So really appreciate that very concise and detailed answer at the same time, Michelle. Thank you. Maybe just to give the panelists a bit of a break, here's a question that I'll take a stab at trying to answer, but of course, always welcome the panelists to chime in with any added comments. The question is, what is the council focusing on to reduce the carbon intensity of canola grown in Canada? So we've heard carbon intensity mentioned by the panelists today. The way that we view this going forward, carbon intensity that is that it could become, and maybe already is, table stakes to compete. Michelle did a great job outlining the importance of carbon intensity to the fuel producer in terms of low-cost compliance, more efficient generation of those credits that we've been talking about. So carbon intensity is absolutely a priority for the Canola Council of Canada and for the broader canola industry. In terms of some activities that the council and others in the canola family have undertaken is around nitrogen fertilizer. And it's not necessarily about looking to reduce nitrogen fertilizer. It is a critical input into growing more canola, but it's about using that nitrogen fertilizer more efficiently. Nitrogen is a big component of canola's carbon intensity score, and there is room through practices like 4R that can reduce the emissions from fertilizer application. And the Canola Council is doing a terrific job in terms of communicating some of the 4R benefits to the farm community, and has actually participated in some government-funded programs to get higher adoption rates of different BMPs, best management practices, that would support lower emissions from nitrogen application. So that's an important focus of the Canola Council. Another is making sure that carbon sequestration, soil organic carbon, is captured in these biofuel programs. This is a huge advantage for canola farmers in Western Canada. The ability to sequester carbon because of practices like minimal or zero till, and maybe Dean can build on this a little bit, and also the conversion of fallow land to cropland like canola has had a massive impact in terms of removing carbon from the atmosphere. This impact is already measured by our government. This impact is actually included in the carbon intensity scoring for markets like the Clean Fuel Regulation and the BC Low Carbon Fuel Standard. Where we're still lacking and where work needs to be done on soil organic carbon and the recognition of it is in places like the United States, where carbon intensity is also increasingly being rewarded in biofuel programs. So this is another area of focus of the council. It's to spread the word, if you will, on the benefits of farm practices to sequester carbon. Dean, I don't know if you wanted to build on any of what I just said.
I don't think I can add a whole bunch, Chris. I think you did a very good job. Council's very focused on increasing levels of 4R adoption because it's beneficial not just from a climate standpoint, but from a farm profitability standpoint. Being more efficient with your nitrogen will make you more profitable, but it also lowers the carbon intensity score of the canola, which makes it more beneficial to Michelle as a feedstock. So I think there's a win both ways there. And one of the big wins is canola, just some of the biology of the plant helps it sequester more carbon. And that's why it is a preferred feedstock. So I really can't add much to what you said.
Great. Thanks, Dean. I don't know, Michelle, Brian, if you wanted to build on that at all. It's something I'm quite passionate about, in fact, just canola or carbon intensity and doing more in terms of trying to lower that carbon intensity for the industry, because again, it is table stakes going forward.
Yeah, Chris, I would just add, the CFR is structured, and this is why we're so supportive of a framework like the CFR, that the lower the carbon intensity, and it's a life cycle carbon intensity. So right from, even preparation of the soil for seeding all the way through to combustion of a fuel, that's the life cycle that's being considered in the carbon intensity for any of the fuels under the CFR. So anything that can be done to lower that carbon intensity in any of the steps through that full life cycle should be rewarded and is rewarded under the program. So, that's why we're so supportive of actions like that the farmers are taking to reduce carbon intensity of feedstocks and the CFR in general.
Great. Don't hit the mute button too quickly, Michelle. We're coming back to you. This is an interesting question, and it is as follows. Can you tell us who are the main type of buyers who will be buying your renewable diesel? Who is really looking to buy low carbon fuel?
So I'd probably put this into two different camps. So the first camp, but I would just say, is kind of general blending into the fuel that, you and I buy every day at our local retail station. Under the CFR, a primary supplier or a fuel supplier develops an obligation effectively on the volume of fuel, of conventional fuel that's sold, and needs to offset that with credits generated. In addition to some of the other pathways like vehicle electrification and charging credits, if we kind of stick to blending pathways or credit creation mechanisms, blending biofuels into just the general fuel pool is one of these mechanisms, and then will create credits, and is really going to be a large demand source or for suppliers to meet their obligations. So just like we have ethanol in the gasoline that we use, in our vehicles today, and biodiesel and maybe renewable diesel in, diesel that we would be using for personal uses today. That's going to be kind of a source or a sink for the renewable diesel under the clean fuel regulations. So that's the first kind of grouping that I would say, is going to be a demand source. And then the second is specific companies. So those who are looking to reduce their carbon footprint of their operations to meet greenhouse gas objectives, potential net zero 2050 targets. When we look at some of our customers, they're really looking to go over and above what is mandated in regulations to meet their own specific corporate requirements. So those are the two kind of areas I would say are our big demands.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. And let me just see, which one should I pick here? Well, here's a good one. Are the opportunities in canola meal focused mainly on livestock feed, or is there work being done on identifying or scaling up new uses for canola meal? Maybe Brian, if you wouldn't mind taking a stab at that one.
Sure. Certainly, livestock feed is the primary destination for a lot of our meal, obviously in dairy, in beef, and to a lesser extent in poultry and swine incorporations. We're seeing a lot of work and a lot of development being done in aquaculture feed as well. And I think that's one of the exciting new areas where we're going to see a lot of growth and development. And seeing how these markets have grown over the last number of years, I think gives us a lot of reason to be optimistic for that. So I think we're seeing a lot of growth in this space primarily. There are other areas, I think, in terms of protein concentrates where there's some work being done as well. And I think that holds a lot of promise, but that I think will take a little bit of time to develop. But I think certainly livestock and aquaculture feed, I think, can provide a good reason to be optimistic about consumption in that space.
Great. I maybe spoke too soon. If I can hold the panelists maybe just for one last question, and this one just came in. Michelle, it's you again. Can you speak to how the other pathways, so on one of your slides, you spoke to the different means for compliance and the different investments being made by the fuel refiners on the CFR and how to comply. So for example, electrification as an option. How does that compare to the biofuel credit generation pathway? Kind of a detailed question, but a really excellent one.
Yeah, so thanks, Chris. Maybe I'll just start off by saying there are really three different credit categories under the CFR. So the first is projects that reduce the life cycle carbon intensity of fossil fuels. So think about this as fuel switching at a refinery, using hydrogen instead of natural gas in a boiler or process heater that's going to reduce those process CO2 emissions through the creation of a fuel. CCS is a big element in this category. The second category is what we're probably familiar with in terms of blending biofuels, where credits are created based on the difference between the carbon intensity of the biofuel and the reference carbon intensity, or that mandated carbon intensity in any compliance period. And then when we turn to electrification, it's actually very similar to biofuels on a life cycle basis, looking at what the difference is in the carbon intensity of that electricity versus the fuel that it's displacing. So in a light duty vehicle where we would presume that gasoline would have been the fuel being used, the credits are really created based on the difference in the carbon intensity on the electricity in the province in which that electric vehicle was being charged, and the mandate for that compliance period. I think in terms of volume, we're still seeing, with today's vehicle fleet, that the liquid fuels, that second category of credit creation, is where the vast majority, kind of probably, close to 100% in from 2022 to today, still looking at probably, I would estimate maybe 80+%, in the years to come, of those credits are gonna originate, just because of the vehicle fleets that we have today. But that electrification is very, very similar to any other biofuel.
Great. Yeah, I mean, liquid fuels aren't going anywhere anytime soon. So there's definitely an important role for low carbon liquid fuels to play in the future. So we got a couple of minutes. There's still some questions that were left unanswered. Apologize that we didn't have a chance to get to them all, but love that everybody was so engaged with some really excellent questions. Again, if we didn't get to the ones that we hope to, we will get to them and try to address them by email. So look out for that. We will also email a link with the webinar recording in the next few days. You're welcome, and we encourage you to share the recording with your network. So in closing, and on behalf of our panelists, and the Canola Council of Canada, the Canola Growers Association, Alberta Canola, SaskCanola, and the Manitoba Canola Growers, thank you for joining today's webinar. And again, thank you to the panelists for providing an informative discussion. I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thank you.